Welcome to the Strong Women Podcast, where we explore a deeper understanding of the humanity, value, intellect, and creativity of women. I'm your host, Erin Kunkel.
And I'm your co-host, Sarah Stonestreet. Our guest today on the Strong Women Podcast is Bessie Knooster, which isn't that a fun name to say? I love it so much. I had to practice it several times, but I think I got it now. Knooster. I need to tell you a couple things about Bessie. The way that we heard about Bessie is from her sister, Cheryl Kay. And we've mentioned Cheryl Kay several times, but I just want to tell you about Cheryl Kay. She is our producer for this podcast, and she is a rock star. She keeps us all level-headed and in the right direction and organized and visionary and all the things. And she's become a super good friend. So when she said, hey, you really should get to know my sister, Erin and I said, sure. So we're super excited that Bessie has chosen to spend this time with us. But I also wanted to highlight something before we really get into it, because Bessie doesn't have a platform. She's not an author. Her social media is not going to blow up when she posts this interview to it. But what we really want to focus on the Strong Women Podcast is that it's women in all spheres of influence. The idea of strength as a woman is not that you have a platform or you have fame or everybody knows your name, although that sometimes is the case. But we think that showing strength as a woman made in the image of God is looking at your spheres of influence, no matter how big or how small, and acting with intention, loving as Christ loves, and being faithful in those spheres of influence. So a lot of the women who are walking this out, you will not know their names because they're doing the faithful thing with their children, with their grandchildren, in their churches, as a single woman, in her job, in her larger family. Like, there's all these different spheres of influence that are unique to each one of us. And so we want to make sure that we highlight not just names that are known to everybody, but names that you may not have known otherwise. And so we're excited to invite you into this conversation that we're about to have with Bessie. So welcome, Bessie.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah.
So, Bessie, just for our listeners, we know you are a mom of 5 children. Your husband's in the Air Force, and we're going to talk about being a military wife and what that has been. We're also going to talk about chronic illness with you. And so, but before we start those conversations, let's start and just help our audience get to know you. So where did you grow up? And what kind of family did you grow up in? Those sorts of things.
I was born in Kansas, in Wichita, Kansas, and my parents were from there. My parents were saved before I was born, so I was raised in a strong Christian family. But when I was young, I think around 4, we moved to Southern California for my dad to go to seminary. And so I actually did most of my growing up years in Southern California, but our roots are in Kansas, and my parents moved back to Kansas several times and finally landed there. And so I'm like a Kansas girl and a California girl, both. But I grew up in a strong Christian home. Yeah, it's an interesting mix. It is. And I am the oldest of 10 siblings. Yeah, I got to be the guinea pig child, you know, how that is the oldest one.
Yeah, the oldest of 10. Wow, you really had to lead the way in your family.
Yeah, and the second mom, you know, to some of them, younger ones.
Yes, for sure.
And all of that.
So when you were growing up, do you think did you kind of attach yourself to the faith, become a Christian pretty early on, or what was your journey in your faith?
Yes. I don't remember ever not understanding the truth of the gospel. It was proclaimed in our home and at church faithfully from the very beginning. And so my mom tells me I prayed the sinner's prayer when I was 4. I don't even remember it, but I believe that I did and that I was saved. And like I said, I've never known anything different. And so through my teenage years, though, I did come to recommitment when I, you know, as you grow, you realize more and more what what a commitment to Jesus really is,
Yeah.
in that next phase of life and as you go forward. And so I did recommit my life to the Lord and just continue to grow in that. But I'm very thankful for being raised in a strong Christian home and having that heritage. It's a blessing and a privilege. And I'm hopefully passing that on to my children as well.
So after growing up years, when did you move out of the house and kind of start your own journey?
We moved, one of our moves from California to Kansas was the year I graduated from high school. And my dad took a pastorate of a small church in the middle of Kansas. And I lived at home initially for the first couple of years. And I did secretarial work, did a secretarial course at college. And then I did that kind of work. And I realized I liked that work. And while I was still single, I wanted to work in a Christian ministry if the Lord allowed that. And so because of the connections we'd had in Southern California and where my dad went to seminary and some church things, I actually got to move back to Southern California and become a secretary at the Master's Seminary. And so that is actually where I met my husband at that time. But I was it was 2021 when I did that. And so I had lived at home before that. And then I did that for a year. I came out to California for a year and worked at the seminary, loved it, and met my future husband. And then my grandfather passed away in Kansas, and I felt the Lord calling me to move back to Kansas and live with my grandmother and be with her and minister to my family. And I think it's really interesting because I had no idea I was actually going to marry someone in the military. And I felt as a single, you keep getting the messages that, oh, you're free, you can go do whatever you want when you're single and take advantage of that. But I really felt like God was telling me, you're free to still spend that time with your family.
That's a good point, because when you're single, oftentimes in the church, singleness can be kind of looked down on or whatever. But that is such a good perspective of the beauty of being single is that you don't have to ask someone else, a spouse, and you can really be devoted to the family that you grew up in a way that you can't once you get married. It does change things. And that's a really beautiful thing that you did, to choose to use your singleness to go back and live with your grandma and minister to her. That's really neat. Okay, so I was going to ask you about the whole Air Force thing, and if you knew you were marrying into the military when you did get married, your husband was at seminary, so how did seminary and the Air Force connect and all of that happen?
Yeah, well, my husband actually had been in the Army previously, not right out of high school, but early in his 20s. He had been in the Army for 7 years and then got out and said, I'm never doing that again.
Don't say that.
Yeah, exactly. Never say never. And so he wasn't saved at that time. And when he got out, the Lord used several circumstances to then draw him to himself, and he was saved. And when he got saved, he had this hunger for the word. And so he was here in Southern California, and he heard John MacArthur on the radio. And so he went to Grace Community Church and decided to then go to college. He hadn't done college yet because he had gone into the military. So he went to the college and then the seminary. And it was in that time of college and seminary that he felt the Lord calling him back to the military. And he was going to be an Army chaplain because Army is what he had known. But when we started dating and got engaged and were serious about that, he decided to switch to Air Force because Air Force is better on the family, less deployment times apart and things like that for not every job's exactly the same, but he decided to go Air Force. So yeah, I had no experience with the military. I had some grandfathers and great uncles, that had served, way back when, but I had no personal experience with anyone in the military. So that was a whole new ball game for me.
Yeah. Did he lose his Army buddies? Because my parent, in a joking way, but my dad was in the Army, my mom was in the Air Force, and so they have this friendly rivalry.
Yeah.
But if you are in the Army and you switch to the Air Force, you might get some harassing. You know?
Yeah, you can, but most people also understand why you do that.
Right.
My husband would say, I saw the light and I moved to the Air Force.
Right.
But, if God had called him to the Army, then that would have been where he was supposed to be. And that would have been where we were supposed to be. And so I'm thankful God called him to the Air Force.
Yeah.
But, the important thing is just to go where God is calling you and serve where he's calling you, because we need chaplains and godly people in all branches and everywhere in all of society and all of life. So,
So were you, because when we think about being the spouse to someone in the military, you just know that you are going to spend time apart in ways that people in, marriages where your spouse works 9 to 5, you see each other every day. And Sarah and I both have husbands that travel for their work. So we get a taste of that, weeks apart or whatever.
Right.
But when you have a spouse in the military, that means you're going to spend months and months apart sometimes. So when you got into it, were you afraid? How did you wrestle with all of that?
Yeah, there was some fear, but mostly there was peace, just knowing that we were where God wanted us to be, and that I fully supported and believed in his ministry and where God had called him, and that I was called to be his wife, and that was going to be my job to support him and to raise our children. And we never went into that going, oh, yay, we're going to be separated. That's never a joy in that sense. But we made a commitment to stay connected and to stay close and to honor each other and to keep our marriage strong.
So you didn't see yourself during that time as a single parent. You're still seeing yourself in partnership with your husband and raising the kids. And despite him, it presents challenges even when our husbands are gone for a week. It presents challenges that it's like, okay, yeah, we're not single parents, but just that, yeah, you obviously have to take on a lot more. You don't have the person there every night to bounce things off or, what do you think about this? This is what I think about that. And
or to drive everybody everywhere.
To get people places. Yes. Just
goodness.
The practicalness of, running things all by yourself.
Well, and there is that aspect of single parenting. You are doing a lot of that when they're not there. But there's that support aspect of you're not alone, and that this is not forever, thankfully. But I have told my husband when he's come back, I don't like being a single parent. I don't want to keep doing this, because there is that aspect of it does feel like that sometimes, being realistic. That's true. But it's a mindset, and an attitude that we're still a team. And when we still discuss things. It's not always possible. Sometimes you can't reach each other. Sometimes the schedules don't mesh and all of that. So you do what you can.
So like Aaron said, our husbands travel a lot. And there's this adorable lady at our church who is just so affirming to everybody, but she's like, oh, Sarah, how do you do all the things that you do? And you're like, you're practically like a single parent. And I always push back on her because I know she's affirming me, like, wow, you're doing a lot. I'm like, I'm not, because I know we have some single moms listening, and it is a different ball game because to have that emotional support is different. It is challenging in a different way than a single mother has to. It's endlessly being that person who makes the decisions and runs the household and, all that stuff. So I just wanted to acknowledge that because I think that's what we're saying here is like it, in a lot of ways we get a taste of it. And so we can appreciate and really pray for those single moms in our lives, but we also are not in the same boat since we.
Yeah, I think, I had some years of single motherness myself, and it is similar when my husband's gone, and just that everything is on your shoulders to make happen, especially like getting kids somewhere. Like I often as through the years, and Bessie, you probably have done this too, when I think about commitments that I make, especially with my kids, for example, like if they're going to be on a sports team or in a club or doing this, I have to decide and filter it through, can I do this by myself as if I were a single mom again? Can I handle this commitment completely on my own? Because if I commit to something for me thinking, well, my husband's going to help me get the kids there or do this commitment, then I just get frustrated at him
Right.
when he's gone. Because then I'm like, oh, he's not here to help. But it's like, well, I shouldn't have signed up for this because this was probably too much for me to do on my own.
Then if they can take them, it's like, oh, yay. What a nice little surprise.
Yeah, bonus. So
Yeah.
your husband has been deployed and you guys have been married 20 years. Is that right?
20, yes.
Okay. So what's been the longest time that your husband's been gone that you've had to handle things on your own?
The longest for us was 7 months. We are actually very blessed. God's been gracious with us that we haven't had too many deployments. We've only had about 3 major deployments. And then there's always the smaller stints for training here or there. But 7 months was the longest for us. But it was interesting because, and you guys might, I'm sure you relate to this too, that, if you have a trip where oh, they're going to be gone so long, and then it gets extended for some reason, and you're like, oh, well, I had planned for this amount of time and I could handle that. But when it gets extended beyond what I was expecting, oh, they're not going to be back next week or whatever the case might be. It's interesting because the 7-month one, we knew it was going to be 7 months. And so I was, prepared for those 7 months. We had the countdown on the calendar. But then we had another deployment that was supposed to be 1 month, and it ended up being 4.5 months. And just kept getting stretched and stretched and stretched. And even though with that one, I only had 1 child at the time and not as much to handle, that one was a harder deployment just because I was like, he's almost home. Oh, no, he's not. Oh, he's almost home, but he's not. That kind of back and forth. So,
which don't you think that speaks to expectations and our mindset, kind of what you were talking about earlier, like your mindset of we're still going to partner in this, even though your job is calling you away from us.
Yeah.
But that expectation thing, which I think speaks to all kinds of areas of our life,
yes.
But that must have felt like the longest 4 months because when you have the expectation, you kind of gear yourself up for things. It's kind of like when we have a job and we think there's going to be an end and then that gets extended. Or, you could think about it in so many areas. I often say to like pregnant gals, make plans all the way up to your due date and maybe even beyond that because it's all about expectation.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're anticipating, and then the days feel like weeks. And for you, those few months must have just been so hard. And actually, I'm not trying to minimize, too, because when our husbands go away, they go away on a business trip. Your husband actually is going into combat and putting his life on the line. So how did you handle that? Like, it just seems like, are you just daily having to trust the Lord with your husband's very life in a way that we don't really think about? Of course, our lives are in the Lord's hands, all of us, and none of us are guaranteed tomorrow. But in a real way, you were having to think through that.
Yeah, some of that. My husband, being a chaplain, he isn't allowed to carry a weapon. And he has an assistant that goes with him that carries the weapon. And so he has been in combat zones to do the ministry. And actually, he loves that. It's very good ministry in those places. And he always says with deployments, he loves the ministry of a deployment. He loves his job at those times. He hates being away from us. So there's that conflict. And so a lot of times he doesn't tell me all the details and I don't want to know, where all he's been until after the fact or what's going on. But yeah, definitely very practical opportunity to just be praying and living that, trusting the Lord, that the Lord's going to take care of us. The Lord knows the details. He knows that we want him back safely, just like every family And we'll cross the bridge when we come to it if we have to deal with more. You can prepare in some ways, but you can't really fully prepare for those types of things, but the Lord walks through it with you when you have to go through it. So,
and when he's been deployed, are you involved with like their wives or anything like that?
yeah, it's looked different at different times depending on where we were living and how many kids I had and, all the dynamics. A lot of times I will spend part of the time going back and seeing my family and spending time with my parents and cousins and aunts and uncles and all that, and have that opportunity to spend time with the family and have their support and their help. But then there are also the times of just really entering in with the community. The military really is its own community. We always kind of have said that we see ourselves as missionaries to the military, but we don't have to raise our own support, which is nice. But you get involved in the community, and they have their own language and they have their own issues that they deal with, in that. And so you get to know your neighbors and support each other. We're all in the same boat in that sense, that somebody has a husband gone at some point all the time, pretty much, and or a spouse or whoever it might be. And so you rally and you support each other and you interact and you do more things with other moms and you share responsibilities and you just work within the community and don't isolate yourself.
Yeah.
That makes it harder.
Right.
I think would bring community. Again, we all need community, but that kind of for you guys, it really brings it to like, to survive, I need community.
Yeah.
And I just have so many friends and family in the military, and I know how vital a strong community is to have, especially when your spouse is deployed. I love that part too of what military families model for the rest of us, of how community is so vital and can be so enriching in our lives. Okay, so not only do you have to think about your husband and when he is deployed, that he is putting himself in high risk situations, but then about 20 years ago, you found out you had a chronic illness. And you've had to battle that too. So can you just tell our audience a little bit about that, when you were diagnosed and how that journey started?
Yeah. I had always had really good health. I never had any health issues growing up. And then the year that my husband and I married, we married in 2000. And so that year I got pregnant with our first baby right away. And his grandfather and his father both died. And then we had 9/11, and then he got called up. He was a reservist at the time, and he got called up to go serve as a reservist 1 month before I was due with our first baby. And so looking back, I can see kind of all these things lining up to the stress that was building. At the time, I felt like I was handling everything and I was okay. But after I had my first baby, I kind of never recovered from that birth. My body just started falling apart. And I ended up with a diagnosis 3 months after she was born, diagnosis of ulcerative colitis. And I had a severe case. And my husband, he was at a reserve base here in the States, but away from us. And so I was taking care of an infant and just trying to survive with an infant and getting more and more sick. And went to the doctors and got the wrong diagnosis and tried what they were telling me, changed my diet, whatever, and it wasn't working. And so by the time he got back, I was in really bad shape. And so he basically said, I'm taking you to the ER right now. And had to leave my baby with my mother-in-law and with a bottle that she'd never taken a bottle, and it was crazy. But I was in the ER and they gave me lots of fluids and they said, we pretty much know what you have, and they diagnosed it correctly. And so they say with autoimmune diseases, that they can't pinpoint exactly why you got it. There's usually several reasons, stress and genetics and what you've been exposed to and, all that kind of stuff, and diet. And so I can look back, years later and see kind of what happened during that time and go, okay, yeah, I think genetically, I must have a little bit of a weakness there, but then that was, when everything crashed. So, I've been dealing
What a
with
stressful time. Yeah. And like you said, you were just getting through it, but then, when you're not getting better. Okay, so can you explain the disease a little bit for our audience? Just kind of what the symptoms are and what you kind of had to battle.
Yeah, it's ulcers in your colon. It's ulcerative colitis. And so your colon gets very sick, which is the center of your body. And so it affects a lot of things. But basically, when I would eat, everything would just go right through me. I had severe diarrhea all the time. And then you get to a place where you're also nauseous. It kind of feels like having a really bad 24-hour bug, but all the time.
But all the time.
It doesn't go away. And so I would lose all the fluids, and I'd be really malnutrition and anemic, and all of that kind of stuff would happen, and you get really weak. And then you're also bleeding from your colon. Ulcers will bleed. And so I've had different points in my journey where I've almost bled out, and I had to go to the emergency room and, have emergency care for that. And then other times where it's, so where it can be very intense and very severe in one moment, but then other times it can just kind of be a slow, steady downhill, trend. But so I've had times where I've been hospitalized various times, and then also times where I've been on bed rest trying to recover. And I've been through several different drugs over the years, and sometimes they work for a little bit and then they stop working, and so then they have to try something else. I've tried very strict, severe diet changes and elimination and lots of natural herbs and natural things. I've tried just about every route that you could think of, because to begin with, they're like, oh, you have this disease, take this drug, you'll be okay. And I was like, okay, I believed all the doctors and just did what they told me to. And the drugs had really not fun side effects, and I felt awful. A lot of steroids I had to be on. And so steroids just have a lot of side effects. And they'd say, oh, you can't stay on these drugs for very long. It's not good for you. So we need to take you back off of them. Well, then they'd take me back off, and all my symptoms would come right back. So now, presently, I'm on an infusion drug. I go every 8 weeks and I get an infusion. So it's kind of like a chemo drug, but it's been helping. And I've just realized for me, and because I've read lots of, when you're not feeling good and you're like just looking for an answer, you start reading anything you can find and listening to anything you can find. Oh, I'll try this and I'll try that. And I've done a lot of that over the last, almost 20 years. And so I come to this place where my case has just been so severe that diet alone wouldn't solve it. And so I never wanted to be on drugs all of my life, but I have been thankful for the drugs that are there, that God provides, that I can function. Because when I'm really sick, I can't function, and I can't take care of my family. And that's the hardest part for me. And so I'm just really thankful for what God has allowed. And all along, there's been this, you'll probably lose your colon at some point. You're more susceptible for colon cancer. I have to be tested regularly for that. And several doctors had told me, you won't have any more children, or you shouldn't have any more children early on. And I have 5 children. And when I was diagnosed, I just had our very first. So I'm so thankful. We're so thankful that God has been gracious, and we've been able to have our children, and that I haven't lost my colon yet. And the big deal about that was, if I lost it, I really wouldn't be able to have more children. That major of a surgery.
Let me back up and ask you, what was your journey with God like? I mean, was there a time of anger and fear? And I mean, so much of the time when we go through suffering, there's that, it's almost like there's stages of it where God, of course, is grafting it into our story. But there are those moments where we're really questioning. Did you experience that?
Yeah, I know what you're asking. I don't think I was ever angry. I think I was sad, and I was questioning in that, God, why is this happening? I don't understand. I don't know what the purpose is in this. Is this going to last forever? Are you glorified in this? How are you glorified in this? But it wasn't in anger. And I really attribute that to the foundation that God had given me in the Word and with my family growing up, that I was grounded already in just knowing that that we serve a good God and that he loves us and that he has a perfect purpose for everything. And if he's allowing it into my life, whatever he's allowed into my life has come through his hands, and specifically to me and to my family. And that was one of the hard things, actually, was not just for me, but it affected more than just me. It affected my family, my children and my husband, and it changed all of our lives. And that was almost a little harder for me to accept, that, my children, this is not the kind of mom I wanted them to have. I didn't want them to have a sick mom. And I didn't want their lives to be inhibited because I couldn't do things. And so that was a struggle. That was hard. And I had a lot of good support. My husband has been an amazing support through the whole journey. And my mom has been an amazing support through the whole journey. And all of my family, all of my extended family, and many, many friends. And I remember there was one time that I was laying in bed and I was bedridden and I couldn't move. I was afraid to move because it hurt. And I was crying and about not being able to be the mom that I wanted to be for my kids. And my mom said to me, she said, "Your kids know that you love them. And that is the most important thing. And you are speaking the truth to them. And this is a season and it will pass. And God will allow you to do the things that you want to do at some point. But for now, this is where he has you and you're loving them, even from right here in your bed." And I just needed to hear that. It was really good, that, okay, I still have a purpose, even though I'm laying here in this bed and I can't move. I'm still praying for my family. I'm still loving them. I'm still reading the word. And my husband, being the military man, he rallied the troops, of our children and said, "Okay, guys, mom can't do such and such right now. We're going to come together and we're going to make sure this gets done and take care of it. And this is something that God has for all of us." And he's been really good about leading us through that God didn't just give that to me. He gave this disease to all of us as a family to work through and grow through. And I learned that my kids could do a lot more than I thought they could. Which,
right.
After I got well, I was like, oh, now I know you can do these things. So, so they've really grown through it as well.
That's a good perspective about the Lord allowed the disease to come to you, but it's for your whole family to carry the burden. It's not just you. That's a perspective I think that I don't hear common, even though the family does carry the burden, but even to say it that way.
Well, we're coming to the end of our time, so we've got a few more questions that we'd like to ask you. And one is, you have young daughters, young women in your life, and we have a lot of young listeners. So what advice would you give to young women these days?
Well, I feel like the older I get, the more I'm convicted by that I need to know the word more. I need to be in the word more. And in these days, there's so much turmoil and it's just continuing and it doesn't seem like there's an end in sight, that we have to be grounded and study the word, memorize the word, sing the word. That is our foundation. And I'm so thankful for the family that I had, that I grew up in, that I was taught those things at a young age. And if you have been taught those things at a young age, you need to value that. And if you haven't, then you can start anytime, dive in. And for moms, do it with your kids. That's what I do. Mm-hmm. My kids and I memorize together and they're way better than I am.
I know.
Their young brains are, memorizing better. And so they help keep me accountable. And it just seems like that's a theme that keeps coming up in my life, is that I need to be in the Word. And I think it's true for all of us. Make that time, make it a priority from when you're young to spend that time in the Word every day, studying, praying, memorizing. I just don't think there's anything better that we can be doing with our time.
Yeah. Okay, Bessie, I assume you're a reader. Actually, we know you're a reader. So tell us what book or books you're reading right now.
Well, I do like to read, but I don't always get as much time as I'd like to read. So I'm actually reading right now the Becoming Elizabeth Elliot by Ellen Vaughn, and that I know you guys interviewed her. It's a great book.
Yes.
And I'm also reading Joyful Surrender by Elizabeth Elliot.
Oh, yeah.
And then, because there's so many of her books that I read a lot of her books when I was younger, and it's been a while. And so recently it just came up and I was like, I need to get back into some of her books again. And so it just happens I'm reading both those at the same time. And then I do read aloud. I try to read aloud to my kids, and we're reading the Wing Feather Saga by Andrew Peterson.
Oh, yeah.
And we're almost to the end, and we've really enjoyed that. So those are, I have so many books, piled up waiting to be read, but those are the ones I'm actually doing right now.
Yes.
Oh, those are good ones.
do
We'll
I.
link those in the show notes.
Yeah.
Okay, last question. What woman from history would you have coffee with if you could?
Yeah, this is a really hard question because there's just so many. And any of them would be good. That's the hard thing.
I know.
They'd all be good. But, I thought of Corrie ten Boom, Susanna Wesley, Elizabeth Elliot, Amy Carmichael, just to name a few. It's really hard for me to choose one.
You're cheating.
I'm cheating. I am.
You can. It's okay. Cheryl Kay's your sister. You can cheat.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing is, I've heard some of your podcasts where someone might pick someone that's in the present day that they don't get to spend much time with as well. And I would say that about my mom. I would love to spend more time with her. And we live in different states right now, and so we don't get to see each other as much. And she is my number one mentor, and I love her to death. So, special lady.
Wow, that's a great choice.
Yeah. Bessie, we are so grateful that you spent this time with us. Thank you so much. Good to get to know you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Strong Women podcast, powered by the Colson Center. To connect with Sarah, Erin, and other amazing women, join our Strong Women podcast Facebook group and check us out on Instagram at Strong Women CC. If the Strong Women podcast has been an encouragement to you, consider leaving a podcast review on iTunes or making a gift at strongwomen.colsoncenter.org. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next week.